Thank you very much, Roger. That was absolutely compelling and evidence that this is just going to be catastrophic for the remaining koala populations that we have. So round of applause. By the way, that is a great invitation to the Tree Kangaroo Mammal Group. And if you would like to subscribe, we do have some spreadsheets outside. If you would like us to share information, yes, of course, we need people to help us write submissions. We get to find out about a proposal every week. It is mind-blowing. Can I introduce to you now Timothy Adjunct Professor Tim Nevard. The title of his presentation is Cranes and Wind Infrastructure on the Atherton Tablelands. Brief bio, a lot of people here are probably familiar with Tim. Who knows Tim? Yep, great. Tim Nevard is an adjunct professor at the Cairns Institute, James Cook University. His career as a landscape ecologist, conservation scientist and practitioner has encompassed projects and initiatives in the voluntary, private, public and academic sectors across 5 continents. Amazing. He has been awarded the Order of Australia and Century of Federation medals for his service to nature conservation of the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Thank you for asking me along. That's some hard acts to follow. The one issue that cranes have in relation to wind farms is that they are not a designated species in the EPBC Act. So I can ask Tanya Plibersek as much as I like, even if there's a significant effect on cranes, and she has no legal obligation to take any notice. So we have on the Atherton Tablelands probably the largest single aggregation of cranes, that's Brolgas and Sarus cranes, in the entire continent. Close to in the entire southern hemisphere, but they're not affected or given protection by the EPBC Act. So we are relying on Tanya Plibersek to provide some break to what is a runaway issue in Queensland, and both Stephen has made it very clear that that's the case. And Roger's look at those high altitude forests for the future, and I think that's a very important thing that nobody has touched on, that they are the refugia for our biodiversity for the future. Whether they're just for koalas or for other things, they are going to be very important, and we've forgotten them. We're just looking at the present. It's not relevant. So I'll just take you a quick traipse through cranes and the Atherton Tablelands. Cranes have played a pretty key role in many Aboriginal First Nation cultures across Australia. This particular image is an image of a story I particularly like about Brolgas. Brolgas was a dancer. It's a New South Wales Aboriginal story. Several First Nations people have it as part of their culture. But as you can see, she and the Brolga become the same thing. And she dances because cranes dance. And all you have to do is turn up to any major Aboriginal celebration and you will, across the country, and you will see people dancing as a crane. But it's not just Aboriginal people. Most of the people in this room I can see, apart from the Djirrabal people over here, are from European and Asian descent. It's our culture too. We've just forgotten it. They're hugely globally visible. How many of you have ever traveled in a Lufthansa plane? Significant proportion of you. You've travelled under a crane. That's what's on their tailplane. How many of you travelled on a Japanese airline plane? Significant proportion of you. That's a crane too. How many of you travelled on Cathay Pacific? That's a crane too. So why do they use cranes? Because cranes live a long time. They create permanent pair bonds, and you can trust them. That's why those commercial businesses borrow that imagery for themselves, and why we should remember it, because it's part of our culture every bit as much as it's part of durable people's culture. So they're not protected under the EPBC Act, but they're culturally really important. Now, I can't point because I was at the back and you couldn't really see it, but the top image, not the Lufthansa plane, but there's a big image, that is the largest single advertisement in Hong Kong airport. And it's an image advertising Visa cards to the Chinese market. So you have 1.4 billion people who understand what I'm talking about. To them, it's really important. It should be to us. Oh, how do I go back? It's also on our state coat of arms. It's a Brolga. It's not an accident, it's there. So what do we have? We have Brolgas and we have Australian Sarus Cranes on the Atherton Tablelands. They're called Australian Sarus Cranes because we've recently discovered that they're quite different from other Sarus Cranes in the world. They're particularly Australian. Where do they live? I'll just concentrate on the top left hand of those images. You can see them. You'll see that there are Sarus Cranes in India, there are Sarus Cranes in Southeast Asia and Indochina, there are Sarus Cranes in Myanmar, Burma, and there are Sarus Cranes in the north of Queensland. Ours are quite different, I mentioned, from the others. Interestingly, they're closer to the cranes, the Sarus Cranes that used to live in the Philippines, which are now extinct. So that's how they probably got here. They flew from the Philippines. Where do they breed? They breed in the Gulf. You can see the next image, number C, down below them, shows the Gulf Plains bioregion. That's where most of our Sarus Cranes breed. And where do at least half of them winter? They winter on the Atherton Tablelands. So you can see how important the Atherton Tablelands are to Sarus Cranes, even though they're not protected under the EPBC Act. So if anything happens to them, half of Australia's Sarus Cranes could be in trouble. Now, I spend a lot of time chasing cranes around the Atherton Tablelands, made 40,000 observations of them, so I've seen quite a few. And what they show is, it shows you there are really two major features. The Sarus Cranes tend to be in the middle of the Atherton Tablelands. That's from Carey to Yungaburra and to Atherton and almost as far as Malanda. And the Brolgas in the north, in Mareeba, and in the south, near Innet Hot Springs and Caban and Tamulin. Those blue circles, which are proportional to the size of the numbers in each area, are Brolgas, and the red are Sarus Cranes. It's the sort of convention. So what do they look like? They look like this. I think Stella and Jürgen Freund are in the audience. Thank you for your photographs, Jürgen. There is a copyright on them, I promise. So those are Sarus Cranes flying over Bromfield Swamp. It's one of our amazing experiences to go up there in the evening and watch them flying in. It's one of our Serengeti type of experiences. If you've never done it, do it. These are Brolgas. They look very similar. They look very similar to Sarus Cranes. Sarus Cranes are redder heads, pinker legs, and Brolgas have a small amount of red on their head and dark legs, grey, dark grey. They breed out in the Gulf. We think they may have a symbiotic relationship, cranes, with the grazing industry in the Gulf. They obviously did with the megafauna that existed here before. Maybe that's happening again, except that the cattle are the megafauna this time. But there is certainly no issue out in the Gulf with their breeding habitat. Brolgas, much the same, again in the Gulf, although many more of them. They fuel up in the Gulf. This is a female Brolga feeding one of her chicks, fueling up. This would be in June, early June, late May. This is on Miranda Downs cattle station. And these birds are in at hot springs, and I collected feathers here and found them again there. So we know they migrate between Miranda Downs and in at hot springs because we've used their feathers. You don't need to cover them in bling and have satellite tracking devices to do it. You can just pick up their feathers and do the same thing, as long as you've got a good sequencer somewhere. So we know they migrate, and they migrate to agricultural areas because they're birds of people. They are our birds. We are their people, very much. And for thousands of years, human cultures around the world have had that relationship. We still have it on the Atherton Tablelands. So here are some more Sarus cranes. Here are some Brolgas in an aftermath of a crop of maize. They glean through the maize, picking it up. That's why they're here. There's Bromfield Swamp, a roost at dawn. In the bottom underneath those swaths of mist, you will see cranes. And they are like koalas. They call. The one thing you notice is the hair on the back of your neck starts to prickle just after dawn because they're calling to each other and they're dancing with each other. Now that's about as lyrical as it gets. That's General Plains Swamp. Until the Warura wind farm, as it's now called, when it was the Chulumbin wind farm, that's the biggest crane roost on the Atherton Tablelands. It's near Innet. Those hills in the background were going to have wind turbines on them. Who's to say that they won't in future? But they're right next door to that swamp. So, where are these crane roosts? Remember, cranes come together. They're social animals like us. They live as long as us, pretty nearly. There's a Picasso-like Siberian crane who's 72 and still fathering chicks today. So they live a long time. They remember things. They have cultural relationships with places. Again, we've forgotten all of that. We used to know it. So here are the roosts on the Atherton Tablelands. Some of them are man-made, like Lake Tinaroo. Some of them are small farm dams. They'll use whatever is appropriate. You can create a crane roost if you know what configuration you need to do it. But these are the ones that are here. I don't know if you can see on my screen. Yeah, that's okay. It's not that obvious. You see the light lime green area over the other green. That is the Atherton Tablelands Key Biodiversity Area. It was designated to protect Sarus cranes. That's its reason for existence. These are the wind farms that exist, 2 of them, Caban and Windy Hill, and 3 others. Oh, sorry, and Mount Emerald, sorry. 2 others, 3 exist. You can see some of them are very close to those roosts. Now, some work that was done in the United States where they had one of the world's rarest cranes, which happens to be one of their national birds alongside the bald eagle. It's a whooping crane. And whooping cranes migrate between a wood buffalo national park in Canada and the Aransas Nature Reserve on the coast of Texas every year. And they fly along the base of the Rockies. And what do you think the base of the Rockies is covered in now? It's wind farms. So you have one of the world's rarest birds. There were 16 whooping cranes alive about 50 years ago. There are now about 250 wild whooping cranes. It's not very many. So you can imagine it's a potential issue. So the US Geological Survey did some work, and they found out that cranes, once they know they're there, they avoid them. So they are not being mashed up by wind farms between Wood Buffalo National Park and Aransas, but they've been forced to assume a completely different migration route. And that may well happen here. Power lines. They do hit power lines. This is a Sarus crane, an adult, hit a power line on the central Atherton Tablelands. That happens. So it does happen to them. We have thousands of them, so the odd crane hitting a power line or a wind turbine, it's not a nice thing to happen, but is it terminal? Probably not. What's terminal is their avoidance. They don't want to be here. So, this is my final slide. I'm not lying. In essence, it's this, choosing, and we've heard it from two other presenters so far this evening, and we haven't collaborated on this message. This is the message. Choosing between nature and renewable energy is not an option. We don't have the option. We must have both. As biodiversity is the essential buffer against climate catastrophe, without it, we are fucked. Power generation at the expense of nature is nuts. Can't happen.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was so informative, and the cranes are probably one of my very favourite animals, so thank you, Tim. We haven't got a lot of time. I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Dominica Tannock. Dominica Tannock is an Australian legal practitioner, flown in from Victoria. Thank you for coming all this way, Dominica. Since 2014, she has been the principal lawyer of DST Legal. Dominica operates as a sole practitioner. Most of her legal practice involves acting on behalf of Australian people in regional communities who are adversely affected by industrial emissions from wind developments, factories, mines, and seek redress. Thank you very much, Dominica.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carolyn. So, my talk, I'm going to pose a question, and then it's really a rhetorical question. I'm going to explore it with you. So the topic is to be or not to be a gadfly. This is the question in modern Australia. So what does it mean to be a gadfly? A gadfly is literally an insect, such as a horsefly, that bites livestock. Historically, the gadfly was a term that was used in legal proceedings in ancient Greece when the philosopher Socrates was on trial for his life. Socrates stood accused of not believing in Athenian gods, and he was also accused of corrupting Athenian youth by teaching them to doubt the status quo. In his defence, Socrates claimed to be the gadfly of the state, that the value of his role in Athenian society was to sting people and whip them into fury, all in the service of truth. Metaphorically, a gadfly is a term used today to liken someone who persistently challenges people in positions of power, or challenges the status quo, or challenges orthodox thinking or a popular position. As an Australian legal practitioner, I have had the privilege to represent ordinary people living in regional communities, largely in Victoria, who, in the service of truth, have had the passion, courage, tenacity to challenge power, orthodox thinking, popular positions. often with very limited financial resources. What have we done, why, and how? Over the last 10 years in my client's service and on their instructions, as a sole practitioner with no staff, I have sued and/or are suing presently state ministers, local government, superannuation funds, publicly listed Australian companies, businesses owned by multinationals, and businesses ultimately owned by foreign state organisations, including Chinese state-owned companies. The subject matter of the disputes has mostly concerned adverse effects from proposed or operating wind farms on humans and the natural environment. This evening I will share with you a true story of an amazing human being who is no doubt a gadfly and most probably considered an annoying pest by those in positions of power and industry. I've got a couple of photos. So this is John Zakula and Noel Uren, who took on a superannuation company in 2021, sued them for noise nuisance, was denied by the developer. They won. They got an injunction ordered by the Supreme Court, shutting down the wind farm at night to protect their sleep, and it settled before the order was made on commercial terms. But the fact was, these were two ordinary people who took on a superannuation company and their teams of lawyers, and the wind farm company was denying that the noise was a nuisance, but at the same time we found out that they were claiming liquidated damages themselves for excessive noise from the turbine manufacturer, millions of dollars. Next slide, yes. No, go back to the... This guy here is Hamish Cumming. You might have heard of him. He has been suing the Minister for Planning and developers for the last 5 years. He took it up to the High Court in Canberra. I met Hamish Cumming in 2018 at a public hearing. The Minister for Planning had convened this hearing to inquire into the environmental effects of the proposed Golden Plains wind farm project, which was the largest wind farm proposed for the Southern Hemisphere. West Wind submitted thousands of pages of technical reports prepared by supposed experts with glossy covers. Wherever West Wind acknowledged any adverse effects on the project, they were always downplayed. Noise would comply with the limits. The visual blight of the turbines on the flat, open landscape could be screened with trees. The direct, indirect, cumulative impacts on at-risk native species of state and national importance and value could be managed, minimised and offset. Hamish Cumming was passionate about Brolgas. He was not my client at that time. I did not know that he had always been critically concerned about the environmental effects of wind farms on Victorian Brolga population. Before the public hearing, Mr. Cumming read all the expert reports. He lived about 2 hours away from the project, and he was a farmer on a cattle farm. He took time off work to travel to the public inquiry, to participate in the public process, to listen to the expert evidence, to scrutinise it, cross-examine witnesses, including West Winds, to make oral and written representations to the panel. He obtained reports from academic mathematicians who checked the proponents' modelling. He was fully engaged in the public process. Mr. Cumming had no legal representation. He challenged the experts on his own. He challenged the panel's independence and he challenged their integrity openly. His efforts were not always polished, like the proponents' lawyers, but they were fearless. The panel chastised Mr. Cumming from time to time in public, which would have been embarrassing and off-putting for most people, but Mr. Cumming was not deterred. In the end, due to the personal efforts of Mr. Cumming, the panel recommended to the Minister that the project should proceed, but it should be reduced by 50 turbines to protect the Brolga. I could go on and on and on about Mr. Cumming, but I won't because of limited time. I'll just keep going. But Mr. Cumming has delayed this project for 5 years. He has been involved in litigation. He is a fearless person. That's the Minister for Planning. Yeah, I think he was, Mr. Wynne resigned last year. I think he'd had enough of Hamish Cumming, actually. What I can also tell you, next slide, what I might also show you. So these are two gentlemen who took on the Bald Hills Wind Farm Company, owned by a superannuation company. They won. Next slide. It was the first case in Australia of a noise nuisance. As I said, the Supreme Court said that the reports prepared by the operator, these were her words, not mine. She said they did not demonstrate compliance, as they asserted. She said they were patently absurd, obviously unsound, plainly wrong, plainly flawed. The same acoustician who prepared the noise reports for this wind farm, Bald Hills, prepared the noise reports for Mount Emerald Wind Farm and for a lot of wind farms around Australia. I was involved in this panel hearing, Willatook Wind Farm, again, a public process. People participated, they got drone footage, they showed that there were wetlands over their lands that weren't drained, as the proponent said. The wind farm was given approval, but the conditions were so problematic that it is the death knell, as is reported in the Australian Financial Review for this particular wind farm. So you can achieve results in many ways, but you must participate, you must scrutinise. What's the final one? Okay, so I'll wrap up because I know we've got one more speaker, but I just want to say that if you want to try to stop the extinction of protected species in the rush, not the transition, the rush to renewables, you have to do something. Not everything. You have power to do something. Your personal efforts may not be enough, but the alternative is to do nothing, to leave it to others, bureaucrats, the councils, the government, industry. That is hopeless. The foreseeable extinction of protected species will become inevitable. This image that I'm showing up now was just published last week, and you should take inspiration from it. Its rediscovery has stalled 310,000 homes. In this morning's Age, on my way to Cairns, I read that an offshore wind zone off the coast of Western Victoria has been reduced to 1/5 because to protect the South Australian lobster. I hope that you walk away this evening feeling empowered and optimistic. I urge you to be a gadfly. And on that note, and while on the topic of insects more generally, for inspiration, I'll leave you with a quote attributed to the Dalai Lama, quoting from an African proverb. If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito.
That was so inspiring. Thank you, Dominica. I think for all the thousands and thousands of regional areas around Australia that are suffering and having to live watching their ecosystems be destroyed, their mountains, this I hope gives hope. Can I introduce you now to Professor Stephen Wilson. The name of his title, I'm sorry, but I don't think this is going to work. Stephen is an engineer and an engineer economist with over 30 years' experience on projects in some 30 countries, spanning all forms of energy along the value chain. After graduating in mechanical engineering from the University of Melbourne, Stephen started his career as a consultant in energy efficiency and demand-side management. I think because we're running out of time a little bit, I'm going to hand you over to Stephen, and thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you to Professor Lawrence for hosting us here and for the university for having us, and thank you all for coming along. It's wonderful to be talking to you. As Carolyn said, I'm an engineer. Please forgive me. I've spent most of my career as an energy economist, or let's say in the practice of energy economics. And so this is my conclusion, the view that I've reached about these issues is that the kind of system that is being proposed, that is in the official plans, that is part of policy, is actually not going to work It's actually not going to do its job as a power system. Now, you might think I've come here to bash renewables, to say nasty things about wind turbines and solar panels because for some reason they don't suit my personal taste. Look, lots of my friends and family have solar panels. My own mother and father have solar panels. If you have solar panels, it's not a personal attack on you. This is mum and dad. That's the house I grew up in down on the Bellarine Peninsula. As a kid, mum and dad are very conservative, but I would say conservative conservationists. So every holiday was almost in a national park. Every holiday was camping, mostly in a national park. If I see someone pick a flower in a national park, I feel approximately the same as if I see a school child shoplifting in a supermarket. So that's how I was brought up. Now, we're not just talking here about a few panels on roofs. This quote is from our former chief scientist. This is the kind of vision that is being described. These are Dr. Finkel's words. Forests of wind farms, carpeting hills and cliffs from sea to sky, endless arrays of solar panels disappearing like a mirage into the desert. Now, some of us see that and think, oh, that's horrifying. Is that really what we want to do? Other people think this is wonderful. The people who think this is wonderful, I describe this as the romantic poetry of renewable energy. I think they're misunderstanding. Now, two of the words that we hear again and again, we need. We hear it all the time, in the media all the time. When you hear those two words, I want you to ask, and if you're talking to someone who's using those words, I want you to ask, who is included in that first little word, we? It's almost never defined. Does it include me? Does it include the communities in the Atherton Tableland? And when the children say, I need X, Y, Z, I always say, well, need is a very strong word. So when you hear that word need, I want you to say, well, that's a very strong word. Do we really need that and why? Now, I think we in this country have become subject to two, I think these are superstitions. Superstition one is renewable energy can save the planet from climate change. I'm questioning that. And superstition two, we've heard a little bit about this already from Stephen. Superstition two is no level of radiation is safe. I used to think that. I used to get a sick feeling thinking about nuclear energy. And it took me 35 years to change my mind. I'd been brainwashed in the Cold War. Now, it's not just renewable energy can save the planet. What we're being told is renewable energy made in Australia can save the planet from climate change. And so, vast wind and solar farms deployed across the land to generate renewable energy made in Australia. This is the sort of mythology. This is a superstition. A superstition is when you believe that a cause can produce an effect, but it doesn't actually have the power to do so. So, there's this idea that this is going to make us rich and we'll become a renewable energy superpower. Hey, what's not to like? That's the idea. And there are very highly educated people in this country, in very prestigious institutions, that are pushing this message out. And I think we need to question it. So I'm just going to actually focus on superstition one in this talk. Superstition two is a whole other talk. If you remember one thing that I tell you this evening, it is this, that in a power system, you've got to be able to balance the generation and the load, what economists might call the supply and the demand, almost exactly to the second, every second of every day, even to the sub-second level. You've got to keep those things in balance. And if you can't do that, if you technically fail to do that, you can black out the whole system within a minute. The whole system will just collapse. Okay, this is a quote from a German engineer. There are some sensible German engineers still. They've been trying to get the message out. Germany's been going down this crazy path and ignoring the technical realities. Some of you may have seen the film The Current War. That's Benedict Cumberbatch there on the right playing the stubborn old Thomas Edison, and that's Westinghouse there on the left. And of course, the other main figure in that story is Nikola Tesla. The reason I mention this is that over 100 years ago, there was a fight, a war between DC and AC power systems, and AC power systems won. Why did they win? For a more significant reason than, you know, Sony Betamax versus VHS or Apple versus Mac. It's because in order to transmit power over anything more than a few city blocks, you need to do it at high voltage. Otherwise, the losses will just be too big and it won't be worth it. That means you've got to be able to step the voltage up and step it back down at the other end. So you've got thousands of volts and then you come back down to the wall here at 240 volts. We can transform AC, but we can't transform DC. Tesla understood that, and Edison was stubbornly refusing to accept it. Tesla went and worked for Westinghouse. The first big centralized power plant was at Niagara Falls. So instead of little plants in New York City distributing power on a few city blocks, we had the beginnings of the modern power system that we have today. This is the single most important invention or engineering breakthrough of the 20th century. Number one is electrification. It's very important to our health and our well-being and our life and our ability to keep food refrigerated and produce medicines and enjoy the life that we do. This is what our Eastern Australian system looks like. Here on the map from AEMO, it's called the National Electricity Market. We know where we are right now, up in the top right-hand corner there. It's one of the longest, stringiest power systems in the world, sort of 5,000 kilometres end to end. That is actually the power system, so they call it the National Electricity Market. Just keep in mind that the system is a real physical thing with electrons flowing around. The market is a financial layer that sits on top of the physical market, on top of the physical system. The market can't function without the system being in operation. The system can work fine without the market layer, but the market relies on that foundational system layer. That system is a large and complex thing, and we've just learned that it's got to be very finely balanced all the time, and it has to remain stable. So in terms of stability, the voltages have to be stable everywhere. The common system frequency of that synchronized system has to be stable everywhere, and the rotor angle stability. So the machines that make up the generation fleet on that system have to be synchronous. So they're all locked together at a common frequency as if they were on one single gigantic invisible shaft. Okay, and so that's the thing I just want to mention here, is that there's always little disturbances. A unit trips off over there, a large load comes on over here, etc. That's happening all the time. The system has to be resilient enough to cope with that. In the event of a disturbance, the frequency will fall, and you'll see it in the control room, on the indicator in the control room. That has to be arrested very, very quickly, and that relies on the spinning machines on the system to do that. And you see that as the frequency falls, you see that that line slopes down. You don't want it to fall vertically, or you're straight into a blackout. Okay, and so what is keeping that system stable is all that rotating machinery. So if you get a little spinning top and spin it, it'll stand up by itself. Try and balance a spinning top without it spinning, on any surface, and try and write a computer program with a control system to balance a spinning top that's not spinning, and come and tell me when you're successful. What we're doing in our system is we're removing the rotating machines that provide that stabilizing mass on the system, and we're increasing the vulnerability of that system, and at the same time, with all the wind and the solar, we're introducing more and more and more imbalances and disturbances, and we've got less stabilization to compensate for that. So this is a really serious situation. If you're technically minded and you'd like to read a paper on this, I'm a co-author on this paper. I supervised. This is a brilliant student, won the university medal and a BHP scholarship, a Monash scholarship. This was awarded a top 10 paper at the Power and Engineering Society conference the other year in Brisbane, okay? So it's a small, short, elegant paper for anyone who's technically minded, talks about these issues. So we've got this system which is, it's got a balance in real time, this very fine balance, and then at the same time we need to think long-term into the future where there's investment being made, and the system that we've got today, of course, goes back decades. There's decades and decades of investment behind that. So the guys in the control room that are balancing and keeping the system going, they're sort of in the middle of this rolling world that's got decades of investment behind it, and then there's decades of investment in front of us, and then this whole thing is being balanced. And so we're talking about 12 orders of time magnitude here. This slide, I'm not expecting you to read everything here. The thing I want to say here is that in order to understand this large and complex system, you need, the way that this is understood is through models. And not one single model, but there's lots and lots of different models to look at different parts of the system, from the distribution system to the transmission system, the generation fleet, the stability, the real-time balancing, and then you come through to sort of long-term energy balances and emissions and all those things. So every single one of these models is different. You can't connect them all together into one giant supermodel. No computer can calculate that. What this means is, if someone presents you a model as if that's the answer to everything, either they do not understand the power system or they're deliberately trying to mislead you. Okay, so you just need to be aware of that if you're a consumer of models, whether you're a reader of a newspaper or whether you're the Prime Minister. Right, so the quote that summarises this is from Archie, who was a co-author on that other paper. There is no single full fidelity model of a power system, and there's not likely to be. Okay, but there are lots of useful models. You need to understand what they're telling you and use professional judgment in the interpretation of it. Now, what's happening in the real system? I just want to show you a couple of pictures here from the market. So this is a snapshot of the state of South Australia, where these issues are most severe, most advanced. Back in August 2009, when South Australia still had a coal-fired power plant, we're looking at every single half-hour period in the electricity market in South Australia in that month, the demand on the x-axis and the price, the spot price on the y-axis. This is textbook electricity market price formation, signalling the marginal cost of generating an extra unit of electricity in that half hour. They've now blown up their coal-fired power plants literally with dynamite. They're trying to run the whole thing on renewable energy, but they're still piggybacked on Victorian brown coal. This is how the market behaves today. So you can see, and you can roll forward to 2021, that the market now operates on 5-minute slices, not half-hourly slices. You see this in every month. You see this general pattern in every state. You can see that the price level has increased. You can see the price volatility is enormous. What does this mean in practical terms? What this means in practical terms is that no one can produce a bankable price forecast of the Australian electricity market today. You cannot walk, if you walk into a room full of bankers and you say, I want to build a power plant and I'd like to borrow, X million dollars of debt along with my equity investment, and you give them a price forecast from someone's model, they will say, that's very interesting, put it straight in the bin and say, show me your long-term power purchase agreement. And by the way, it must be with a blue chip off-taker. So this whole theory that the market sends a price signal which drives investment, that has been completely killed, for better or worse, by the renewable energy movement, okay? And so you need to understand, so what is driving all this investment is actually all the hidden subsidies that are sitting in there behind the renewable energy schemes. And by the way, we talked to all the bankers in Australia back in 2017, and that picture is clear, right? So the energy spot market is a kind of $15 billion to $20 billion market, depending on the price level. That's all the money churns through that market, but there's contracting around that. So down below that sort of 5-minute to half-hour windows, you've got all that system balancing, and then out there in the longer term, so that's the balancing, all this, keeping the system stable. And then out there in the long term is the investment issue. and there's a futures market. So there's a set of very complicated markets. There's 8 frequency control and ancillary services markets to deal with all that real-time balancing. There's the bulk energy spot market, there's the contracting around it, and that's all before you get to the off-market renewable energy certificates and all the revenue churning through that. So just understand that's what's happening in this system, and it's becoming increasingly chaotic, and the policies and plans we've got are testing the market to destruction. I've said this publicly in evidence in parliamentary inquiries, and I think we're now testing the physical system to destruction. What happens if you try to go from, back in the old days, no renewables all the way out to 100% renewable energy? It's very, very clear in the academic literature that the total cost of the system goes up, and the more renewables you try to force into the system, the more and more and more steeply the cost goes up. So the mythology is, this is free energy. You wouldn't believe how expensive this free energy is once you balance the system. Okay, so we see that in the literature. Most of the literature is focused on Europe. Most of it is not looking anything like 100%. The PhD student who I supervise, he's just finished his PhD, he's modelled the whole system, and we see this very clearly. Okay, so when they tell you it's cheap, it's not true. This is a stack starting from 2010. This is a stack of the generation capacity in that eastern system. So the 2 big chunks at the bottom of the chart, the dark grey is the Victorian brown coal plants. The slightly lighter grey in the middle there is the New South Wales and Queensland black coal plants. Most of the capacity on the system today is still coal, but the official plan is to retire that coal plant and completely remove it from the system. Sitting above that, we've got some gas plants, steam cycle in South Australia, combined cycle. Then the piece that goes right through the middle is the hydro. That's those plants have very long lives. And then above that, we've got the gas turbines, which are like jet engines, similar to an aircraft engine, reciprocating engines, similar to big, gigantic truck engines, if you like, and then the wind and solar at the top. Notice that the wind and solar they're very short-lived assets. So even a brand new wind farm built today will be gone past the end of its life by 2050. By 2050, we need a whole new system, whether we like it or not, whether we like renewables or not, whether we like nuclear or not, whether we like coal or not, whether we like gas or not. By 2050, relative to today, is a whole new system, unless we refurbish old coal plants. How we are going to fill that gap is a massive issue. This is the current official plan. These are the renewable energy zones up and down the coast. We've been very focused on this part of the world. This is the official Powerlink. Powerlink is the Queensland government-owned transmission company. This is what they're proposing to build. The 2 big blue circles are pumped hydro facilities on the scale of Snowy 2, but without as much water storage in them. There's going to be significant ecological impacts from those, I would have thought. There's been no proper consultation so far, let alone proper assessment of the environmental impacts. This is what they're driving us towards. Now, this is from the AEMO Integrated System Plan. This is showing, the top blue line is this hydrogen superpower story. That's another presentation. I don't think that's going to happen for a number of reasons. I'm zooming in on the right on the other part of the chart. This is their sort of favoured scenario, their step change scenario. The thing to notice here is that when you try and build a system with all this intermittent generation that's not there all the time, it's not there when you need it, you need to overbuild the system by many, many times. And then as you do it more and more, you end up a lot of the time just curtailing that capacity because you can't take it, and it's actually not economic to store most of it. Everyone sees this result. This chart is from the PhD research thesis I mentioned before. So we see this, that if you tell the model you can't build a nuclear plant, you've got to get rid of all the CO2 emissions, you're only allowed to use renewables, you end up basically a 3 times overbuild becomes a 6 times overbuild. And then what you see is just the costs of this are like $180 a megawatt hour. With nuclear, it's about half that. That's kind of the big takeaway headline message. Okay, these are just pictures showing how the system's actually balanced. It's mostly coal, Tassie is hydro. That's what we've got today, that's what they're trying to replace. Okay, so that's a sort of typical week in the national electricity market, broken out state by state, and with these synchronous AC interconnectors between the states and the submarine DC connector across to Tasmania. So this renewable revolution has barely begun. Like you're seeing this, the industrial scale, it's actually barely begun. That's what South Australia looks like. This is what the system could look like if you had plants that are not part-time, that are actually available all the time, can generate all the time. Okay, that's where you've replaced half the coal fleet with nuclear, and then this is what it looks like if you've, in the longer term, replaced all the coal plant with nuclear. Now, one thing that surprised me in these results, there's still quite a bit of solar in there and there's a little bit of wind. So nuclear and renewables can actually work together, and that is, if you ask the solver to optimise, that's the kind of result it gives you, provided the nuclear plant has flexibility, which the modern plants do. Okay, so that is something that surprised me. I would not have thought that was the case several years ago. Stephen's shown a slide from the Net Zero work. Encourage you to just Google up the Net Zero Australia website and you can download their long report. This is from slide 111. This is showing the great big solar farms, those black blobs there, are solar farms in this gigantic renewable scenario overlaid on a land use map, 6 times the size of Tasmania. That's what they're talking about. Again, some people think, isn't that wonderful? Other people think that's horrific. So I'm actually going to leave you with Bill Leake. My line is, you wouldn't believe how much all this free energy costs. Bill sort of nailed it with this. The reason our bills are going up is because they're force-feeding this uneconomic stuff into the system. So, and I'll just finish with a quote from, this is heard in a small room in Washington, DC, is do the math. When you step back and do the math, you see the picture and you understand we need to think about Plan B. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. What an education. I hope everybody has enjoyed this event. I was going to speak for 5 minutes. I've now cut it down to just probably 30 seconds. Look, we've put a lot of work. We're Rainforest Reserves Australia. I'm president. We're all the same founding members since 2016. We've put a lot of work in these past few years to protect and preserve our natural spaces along the Great Dividing Range. We want to preserve the climate protective ability they have, their intrinsic cultural heritage, save biodiversity and homes for wildlife, and their habitat to remain undisturbed. We want their untouched nature to continue for generations well beyond our lifetimes. We've called for petitions, we've flirted with all sides of politics, we've joined rallies, organised events, tried to publish in mainstream media, gone hard. We do it because we think it's worth it. We do have hope. Most of those proposals, by the way, I think Stephen might have said, they're actually proposals. We need help with submissions. Numbers count. Please register with Rainforest Reserves. Join us on Facebook. I haven't got time. I did have a lot of things I wanted to say about the betrayal that I feel that we have been succumbed to with nature being betrayed like I've never seen in my lifetime before. And that's why we're fighting so hard to continue with our work. And please, we need help. It's a numbers game. And it's a lot of, yes, I'm going to finish up. There are lovely nibbles. I'm going to hand you over. I do thank you all sincerely for coming. Look, thank you.
We'll close it now.
Let's close.
Okay. Apologies for having to draw this to a close, but TESS seminars are 1 hour, including questions and answers, and we're probably at 2 hours right now. quickly, I mean, there were some intriguing things that were said and talked about here. I mean, wow, pro-nuclear and anti-renewables, and I feel like a member of the coalition right here. I just want to point out there is a certain irony going on here in terms of all this thinking and talking. And let's bear in mind that we've also got, of course, this conservation messages and things that we have to attain. But are there any quick questions? Go ahead, sir, right there.
Yes, my question is to the last speaker, Stephen, the economist. Is Warren Buffett correct when he said the only thing, you know, he's a great investor all over the world and so on, and he, for instance, he said that why didn't he buy an airline company? He said every time I want to think about buying an airline company, I go and have a sex and go to sleep and have a light in it. But what he did say too about renewables, he said that the only sensible thing about renewables is
Yeah. He said the only reason that they invest is for the production tax credits. Yeah.
is that applying, I
Yeah.
hear about a certificate. Is that just a variation?
The way they create the incentive in the American system is through production tax credits. We have a different system, but basically, yeah, it's driven by the subsidies. Yeah.
Okay, great. Another question? Back in the back.
Even before nuclear, what is this huge amount of wind energy for? Is it to help Bob Catter's old steam thing down in Mount Isa? Is it for new cities in Queensland? What is this huge amount of energy, or even if we get a fraction of it, what's it for? Has the government actually answered that question?
Yeah, so you've got to be careful. The capacity of wind and solar is not the whole story, because it can't match the load, and the driver of it is the same issue. It's being driven by all these incentives and subsidies, not by genuine underlying economics.
Okay, maybe one more question right here, please.
Sorry, this might be quite a simple, silly question. This is for Steve and possibly Roger as well. In terms of legislation, so obviously wind farms currently don't have a particular regulation. It can be swept under Nature Conservation Act, etc. is ignored. When you have national parks, they can be under Commonwealth or national state legislation. So why can't we bring the EPBC Act into this, or use the EPBC Act to fight these wind farms when they're destructing habitat for koalas, etc.? Is it because these national parks are under state legislation, or is it just a political economic thing?
So there's no renewable projects in national parks or state forests. However, the state government amended some legislation recently to allow state forests to be opened up for renewable projects. So state forests are not safe, and I believe that we're going to start seeing more state forests opened up for renewables. In terms of the EPBC Act, that's federal legislation, and it's only if there's a threatened, vulnerable or endangered species that's found that triggers the EPBC Act, and then it gets assessed by the Federal Environment Minister. But even then, we don't really have the capacity to comment on that. We can't comment on that decision unless she deems that project to be assessed under an EIS or a PER, Public Environmental Review, which we've had for Sholumbin and the Upper Burdekin wind farms. But I'll talk to you more later.
Okay. All right. We've got one more persistent questioner. Okay, sir, for you. Good point.
A long time ago. It's just a disgrace, really.
Yeah, Dennis.
The big thing of all ecologists over the last 20 years has been that we can get consistency, what we were saying, equilibrium through solar thermal, but you didn't mention that. Can you just tell us why solar thermal is not the answer to see I just spoke about solar thermal.
Yeah, we had an extensive research project on that technology at the University of Queensland, my colleagues and predecessors, and before that on geothermal. The ergonomics are really hard. They're trying to, if you look around the world at the solar thermal plants, so people know, it's the big circular field of mirrors focusing the sun onto a tower with very high heat to generate electricity. They drive a steam turbine, therefore it needs to be at least 50 megawatts or the efficiency is terrible. It's in the middle of the desert. There's no 50 megawatts of customer load anywhere nearby. The research at UQ focused on supercritical CO2 cycles instead of steam, so you can shrink it down and still achieve efficiency. That's interesting technology, could also be applied to other heat sources at small scale. But basically, the economics of solar thermal is really tough.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, folks, we are going to have to draw this to the close. No, I'm sorry, there's just been, I mean, we could go on and on and on, and I'm sure folks need to get on the road. We've got some really yummy beer, drinks, and things to nibble on out here, and thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Big thanks to Carolyn.